Welcome, everyone, to the Leading Together podcast, Insights for Delaware's Tomorrow. In each episode, we sit down with Delaware's top minds and leaders to share perspectives that help advance First Aid Educate's mission, which is to build capacity, raise awareness, and elevate school board leadership across our communities. And today, we're joined by Dr. Aaron Kupchik. He's a leading expert in juvenile justice and school discipline, whose research has shed light on the impact of punishment and policing on young people. He's a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, and he's spent his career exploring how schools, courts, and correctional facilities shape the lives of youth and helping us understand what we can do to create better outcomes, which is incredibly important for all of Delaware, but particularly for FSE and our work with school boards. Aaron's also the author of 6 books, including The Real School Safety Problem, The Long-Term Consequences of Harsh School Punishment, and Judging Juveniles. His work has earned numerous accolades, including the American Society of Criminology's Ruth Sloan Caven Young Scholar Award and the Michael Handling Book Award. But he's not just a researcher, he's a thought leader, and I'm eager to have him share his thoughts with you. But he regularly advises policymakers and presents findings to organizations like the National Academy of Sciences. So we're so fortunate to have him with us today. Aaron, I'm thrilled that you're here, and thank you for being willing to discuss with us how we can rethink school discipline and reduce inequality and create safer, healthier school environments.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's really a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. Your work is fabulous, and your research focuses heavily on how schools shape the lives of young people. Mm-hmm. And there's this larger context, right, of the public education system in which this impact, and children are growing up, they're going to school, and then there's an impact through the public education system. So let's frame for the audience first just the big picture. Kind of what's the role of public education in our society, and why is it so important? Aaron?
Julie, are you there?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right as you're asking your first question, I think my bandwidth gave out for somehow.
No problem.
I'm sorry.
So I'll just edit that out. There's no problem at all. Right? Okay. So what's the role of public education in our society, and why do you think public education is so important?
Oh, I think public education is, as you said, so important. It is really one of the most central. It's a cornerstone to a democratic society. Public education began in the 19th century, where we started investing in public schools. And a real thought leader in the late 19th century, early 20th century was a philosopher named John Dewey. And in addition to thinking about how young people learn best and so on, Dewey spent a lot of time thinking about what how democracy and public education went hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I really think he taught us a lot about thinking of this. We really need a strong public educational system in order to maintain a strong democracy. Public education means that when you have a functioning public educational system, it means that it's not just the wealthy who get an education, but everyone can get an education, which allows them to participate in the marketplace of ideas, to shape their government so that it's not just a government for the few, but a government for everyone. Mm-hmm. And it allows them to participate more economically, so that it's not just reserved for those who are most fortunate to begin with. Mm-hmm. Public education also, it has an enormously important socializing process. Schools are really the first place where young people start to learn their roles in society and how to get along mm-hmm. with other people. Mm-hmm. Certainly, you learn a lot in the home. And some home lives involve more interactions with others than other families do. But it's not until you get to school that you figure out what it means to cooperate and to share and to get along with other people.
Mhm.
And then as you get older, what kinds of paths you might take as an adult and who you are as a citizen, right? First
Mhm.
citizen in a school and then in society. So public education it allows us to um, invest in everybody's upbringing in
Mhm.
these ways.
Yeah, I think they're excellent points. I think that the idea of democracy and a strong democracy couldn't be more important. Socialization, and then what we do with our life. But really, underneath of all of this is like a question of equity, because if individuals don't have access to a strong, highly effective public education system, there are ripple effects, societal and individual. And let's talk a little bit about what the consequences are when a public education system doesn't work.
Yeah, and let me start by saying that I try to have a kind of muted tone on most things. I don't think that society is falling apart. I don't think our educational system is failing and falling apart, but we can do better, right?
Hmm.
And one of the ways to answer your question, one of the ways we can do better, we're seeing it playing out right now. People's skepticism in scientific understandings, like the benefit of vaccines,
Hmm.
is really troubling. This is in large part, a failure of our educational systems. If people do not believe, if they put more faith in the words of politicians who have no scientific training than the entire or nearly the entire scientific community,
Mm-hmm.
that's problematic. That
Yep.
lack of buy-in, that lack of acceptance of what people
Sure.
tell us. So that's not necessarily a matter of equity. It's
Mhm.
a matter. It is certainly a marker of failure, though,
Mm.
on some, not overall failure, but ways we
Right.
can do better.
Sure.
In terms of equity, we have an educational system that also can do much better on equity,
Mhm.
where we live in a wonderful place and everybody has an opportunity to succeed. That's certain, but some
Mhm.
have an easier path to that than others.
Right.
That is exceptionally clear based on any form of data you want to look at.
Mhm.
That there's inequity in our educational system, that people of less means, but so lower income children
Mhm.
tend to go to schools that are less well supported. Students of color, on average, tend to go to schools that are less well supported financially.
Mhm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean they get less per student funding, but it could mean that they go to school in much older buildings
Mhm.
with less qualified teachers, or less educated teachers. So there are a variety of different ways to assess this.
Right.
Um, and when we have that kind of situation, it means that, again, some people have a smoother road forward to success,
Mhm. Mhm.
social success, financial success, what have you, than do others. And that, I mean, I think that most people would say that's kind of, un-American, whatever that means, right? That
Mhm.
it goes against our ideals. But it also, it's dysfunctional in important ways. I think financially,
Mhm.
our financial system is best. If think about the idea of
Mhm.
entrepreneurship rather. If the best ideas and the best minds are allowed full freedom to
Surprise.
go forward, right?
Right.
Rather than us having a filtering system,
Mhm.
only the minds of those who grew up with means have the opportunity to move forward.
Yeah,
Or
it's
the
an excellent point, and I think it's almost one of those things that are kind of hidden in plain sight, right? I mean, we've all seen buildings that school buildings that really aren't ideal. We it's not this new modern LED, tech infused, right? And yet children are still going there, and we know the realities of under resourced communities. So that's why I think this topic is really important to talk about, because we do want to do better, right? And Delaware's education system, there are so many committed people, and I think what it just takes is all of us working together towards a common goal, right? And having a shared understanding. um,
Absolutely.
so board elections are coming up, and a lot of
Yeah.
these decisions are made by local school boards. And interestingly, when we were talking about democracy, turnout is incredibly low. I think there were only less than 7,000 people who voted in the last school board election. And I would love to take that on as a goal to sort of raise that number. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. But, why do you think it's important for the community to be engaged in that decision-making process?
Well, democracy means that we're all participating, or at least most of us
Mhm,
are participating, and
mhm,
low participation means that it's those who are, I don't know what it means. It means it's some who are, I don't want to say most informed necessarily, but most excited about it or are most invested
mhm,
in it,
mhm.
are most likely to participate. I was one of those 7,000,
Good for
and I
you.
will be
Thank you very
again,
much.
of course. No, I think it's important. I think that school boards are really the most accessible part of government that we have, right? They're our neighbors. It's very local.
Yeah.
Um, we can all go to school board meetings if we wish and be heard and have an
Mhm.
impact.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really important to have higher participation so that all voices are heard. Because if it's only, I don't know how that participation breaks down. I've never seen an analysis of school
Mhm.
board elections. But what if it's only the middle class white families who are participating, right?
Right.
That would be incredibly problematic for thinking about democratic decision making and
Mhm.
who's getting elected.
Yep. I agree with you, and I think, on the other side, and tell me if this resonates, but also who's running, right? I mean, I think there's incredible potential and opportunity in every corner, and my our hope is that individuals who could be leaders and aspire to do something for the community see in that role some way for them to make a contribution. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, Okay, so picking up on this topic of the inequities, move to segment two of our conversation. Your research has highlighted how public education systems don't always work equally for all students. A little bit of this you alluded to in the beginning, but there's long-term consequences of this, and a lot of this has to do with how it operates differentially is in the area of school discipline policies.
Mhm.
And you've found a lot of, your research is extensive, but maybe we could just share a little bit about the your research, the data, your findings, and let's make that available for the
Yeah.
audience.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. That is what a lot of my research looks at, is how we eh, police and punish kids in schools. So I've done a lot of
Mhm,
research thinking about policing and what kind of outcomes we get and how productive it is. Are we making schools safer? Are we subjecting students to harms, and as well as school discipline? And generally speaking, what you find is that school discipline, what you asked about, is really problematic. And here I'm not referring. Yes, I've done research in Delaware. I'm not referring just to Delaware. I don't think that we are an outlier. I don't think that we're worse than other places. Um, but how all states do school discipline tends to be really problematic.
mhm,
Take the idea of suspending a child out of school, which is sort of our default response to student misbehavior in many schools.
mhm,
It doesn't help the student's behavior change. It doesn't help the rest of the classroom. It doesn't help the teacher long term. Might help them. It gives them relief that day or for 3 days, let's say. But then the
mhm.
problem grows when the student comes back, right? Research even shows that other students in the school who aren't suspended tend to score worse on tests, on and standardized tests on average, in high suspension schools.
Wow.
Right, so school suspension is problematic in all sorts of ways. It makes behaviors worse,
Mhm.
individualized and school-wise. It hurts families. How does the family then watch over this
Sure.
child, right?
Right.
Um, for multiple days and so on. It is a really problematic response. Now, certainly, there are some times where it might be called for, right? If there is a child who is endangering other people's safety, it makes sense for them to be gone from there for a short period of time.
Mhm, mhm,
But we use it mostly, we as a nation, that is, and as a state, we tend to use it mostly for minor misbehaviors.
mm,
Most school suspensions are for things like talking back to teachers and dress code
mhm.
violations. And my favorite, ironically, truancy, truancy and tardiness.
So
Right? So
so you can't get here, so that was a problem, so we'll make sure you're not allowed here.
exactly. Or you don't want to be here. So, hey, here's your punishment.
Right,
You can't
right.
come.
You don't have to
Um,
come.
and it just means that students fall farther behind, right? It just
Mhm.
means the classes do worse. So, this is a common punishment. It's not the only punishment schools have at their disposal, but it
Mhm.
sets us all up for failure, right?
Right.
It means that we're hurting kids' learning, and the fact that youth of color are far more likely to receive
No
school
question.
suspension for the same behaviors than white
Mm,
students means that
mm.
we're also making inequality grow, right? We're growing racial
Mhm.
inequality by our practices.
Yeah, and that's why I liked how we started this conversation in terms of just sort of the overall design. And part of this is sort of differential access that's kind of baked into the design. It's a systemic problem. It's not a problem just in Delaware. It's just sort of and I think that's why you started back with history. It's the evolution of the story and really has the system adapted as the world around it has. Now we've
Right.
got these fundamental problems, and then you layer on top of it discipline policies that then disproportionate or exacerbate pre-existing inequalities.
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
history of it, why we do this, is something I've been looking at a lot recently. I have a
Mhm.
new book coming out called Suspended Education, coming out in next month or
It's a great
March.
title.
Thank you. Um, that looks at why we do this. You see, no prior research has really engaged with why we do use school suspensions to begin
Mhm.
with. Several prior people have tried to explain why it grew in the 90s, or why we suspend some kids and not others, and what the consequences are. But when I look back, what I found was that before the civil rights era, we really didn't suspend children out of school much at all.
Hmm.
It was an option for many schools, but not one that was primarily used. And
Right.
what happened was it largely grew as a response to resistance to racial desegregation of schools.
Wow.
And this is true not just nationally, but specifically here in Delaware as
In
well.
Delaware.
Delaware was one of the
Mhm.
case studies that I looked into. Most Delawareans are familiar with what happened in the 1970s. It's often referred to as busing, or
Mhm.
forced desegregation, where we were ordered by federal court to desegregate Newcastle County schools.
Mhm.
There were 12 districts before 1978 in the
Really?
county. There were
Really?
12 districts in the county.
I had no
And then in
idea.
1978, Appoquinimink was left alone, and the other
Mhm.
11 were merged into a single Newcastle County school district,
Huh.
subdivided into four regions, which are our
Okay.
current four school districts in Newcastle County.
Yeah.
And the purpose of this was to make sure that, because most of the Black students lived in the city of Wilmington, which was its
Sure.
own district,
Mhm.
and most of the white students lived in the surrounding areas. And so the federal court mandated this as a way to ensure that white students and Black students went to the same schools,
Mhm.
because the hope was that funding would follow the white students. The better teachers, who quality teachers,
Mhm.
would follow the white students. Not that there weren't high quality teachers in Wilmington, but
Sure.
it was to try to equalize things and actually desegregate, as Brown versus Board of Education,
Mhm.
1954 Supreme Court decision said we should be doing.
That's required. Mhm.
That happened in 1978. And what I found was that before 1978, suspending kids out of school just it, it wasn't really anywhere on the radar.
Mhm.
It required high levels of approval. It was infrequently done. It wasn't discussed in school reports, district reports, statewide instruction reports.
Mhm.
Um, it just wasn't on the radar until the schools desegregate, and then immediately it became a hot button issue.
So
Where
interesting.
immediately after desegregation, we turned to kicking kids out of school, primarily Black students who were going into formerly all white public schools.
Wow. It's so important. I thank you so much for spending time with us today. I think it's really important to understand the history, and to look at these patterns and to be able to connect the dots. I think, you know, the past is prologue is sort of what they say, but you have to understand, and those lessons learned really can inform future decisions, right? And I appreciate the way you're presenting it because we're not blaming anyone. We're just pointing out what empirically has surfaced, and that information is useful to inform future decision making.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. No, it's not a matter of blaming people. It's not a matter of making people feel guilty. It's just if we want to do better, and I think it's really important that we try to do better,
Mhm. Mhm.
because we're doing harm to children. Um,
Right.
if we want to do better, we have to understand how things went wrong. right? And we
Yeah,
have to understand what's the source of the problem. And
exactly.
if I can expand just for a second what doing better means,
Please.
one thing I always try to be clear about when I talk about this is in no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that when children act up in school, we should ignore it or look the other way.
Hmm.
Um, you know, often we tend to think in binaries, right? Oh, if we can't suspend kids out of school, then okay, we have to do nothing. Well, that's a silly
Hmm.
idea. And I agree
Hmm.
that's a silly idea. We need to rethink schools to be more the way we respond in functional families. In
Mm.
functional families, when children misbehave, which of course all children do,
Do. Hmm.
we respond. We respond with care. We respond by keeping, that we don't kick them out of the family, even for
Right.
3 days at a time.
Right.
They're still a part of the family unit. There are consequences, but they have the chance to earn their way back into our good graces.
Uh-huh.
Not that we stop loving them, but
Sure.
the punishment ends, and then
Hmm.
we move forward together as a family,
Yeah.
and hopefully by learning something. And
Hmm.
there are all sorts of different practices that we know can do that effectively, that
Right.
hold students accountable for misbehavior, while helping them maintain their membership or feel that they're maintaining their membership as a
Right.
student, as a member of a school community.
Hmm.
Um, these include restorative practices and positive behavioral interventions and supports and
Hmm.
social and emotional learning and things like that. So I just want to add up there that we know how to do better. We
Sure.
can't, we've in fact known this when I was doing my research on what things looked like, including in Delaware in the 1970s.
Hmm.
As the problem of school suspension started to come up, people said, wait a minute, this is what we should be doing instead. And it's exactly what advocates today are calling for is new strategies.
Interesting. But it's everything comes full circle. I mean, these are it's like the science of reading is back too. So, um, but I did want to touch on one thing you said, and I think it's really important, and I appreciate how we're having this conversation because having a challenge with a particular discipline practice or policy is not the same, or looking to improve that or modify that is not the same as saying we shouldn't do anything at all or there shouldn't be rules, because we First Aid Educate and is a huge supporter of our educators. I mean, the teachers that are there day in and day out, they are pouring everything they have doing. I mean, a teacher today has to do so much more in terms of wraparound services and care than anything that was true when I went to school. And so they deserve to have a learning environment where they can teach, right? And they feel safe. Um, and the
I agree.
administrators equally, right?
Yes,
And so
100%.
this is a yes and. This isn't an either or.
Yes,
It's like suspension is
exactly.
doing some harm. What other opportunities do we have to correct the behavior, protect the teacher, protect the other students, create a positive learning environment, right? And do less harm, because we're kind of doing harm as we go.
Absolutely. And it would, it would take investment of resources to help support
Hmm.
teachers, but it would make teachers' jobs safer and easier in
Right.
not even that long of a term, right? We're
Hmm.
not talking about many years for payback. We're talking about weeks or months.
Right, right, and you mentioned PBIS too, and when I was in the classroom back in the early 2000s, that was like the big thing that we were implementing, and I think it's stuck around. The restorative processes sort of happened maybe like a decade later, and it really became big. Um, but it might. Do you think it's a question of capacity to learn and implement? Like, is there sort of a trade off? There's a ramp to get off of the current
Oh,
path,
yeah.
but it requires learning the new path.
Absolutely. I think that implementation that is a huge, you mentioned the term implementation, that's an enormous issue. I mean, I've done research, for example, where I was in schools and day one, a principal said, I'm really excited for you to tell me what you think of our PBIS program.
Hmm.
And I'd never heard anyone mention it after
Oh,
that or
uh-huh.
saw it in action
Really?
for months. I mean, but that's not that uncommon, for schools to have
Sure.
policies
Yeah.
and there isn't buy-in or there isn't
Yeah.
training or
Mhm.
there aren't resources. um, so implementation is a real problem. It's not just knowing that there are practices out there, we should be using them,
Mhm.
but it's actually doing the work, and it is work, it is
Right.
effort, um, to implement it in a way that has buy-in across the board, so that even when you're frustrated, right, even when you're angry as a student,
Mhm.
you follow these practices, and your assistant principal and principal have your back, and dean of discipline and whoever, and they're going along with it too. And it's
Right.
not being undermined by a police officer coming to your room to take a kid out and so on, right? So there's buy-in across the board.
Yep. I do think everyone needs to feel safe and part of the solution, and that'll lead us right into our third segment. Um, but you mentioned something that was a great transition point, because you when we were talking about implementation, you said, "Oh, it's not just about a policy." And so I'll share with you and with the audience that First Aid Educate in 2025 is going to move into sort of a new dimension of providing supports to districts, and it's really trying to build this bridge between the governance and the policy making, and an understanding of the operations and the capacity to implement, right? Because writing the policy to write the policy, if you can't implement the policy, is a great first step, but is not actually going to change what happens in the classroom. And wanting to do certain things but not having the policy to support you is another set of problems. But I think that there's a huge opportunity to work together, the board and the administration. Have you seen that as maybe, districts that are more successful, or schools that are more successful, have greater communication or coordination?
I firsthand, I haven't looked into. I've done more thinking about how individual
Mm,
teachers do a great job of implementing policies and using their charisma. Their entire school districts. I'm thinking of like, there's some districts like Denver,
mhm,
Oakland, some big
mhm,
cities that have taken real leadership steps towards implementing restorative practices,
mhm.
reducing out of school suspension rates with buy-in. Interestingly, those efforts are often led not by school boards, but by students and student
Oh,
movements.
nice. Wow.
Yeah.
Mm, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, if we listen to our students, we can learn a lot
yeah.
sometimes, right?
And that's
Um,
kind of the democracy at work, right? Because
yeah.
they've seen an issue, they're empowered, they have the information, they understand what their civic options are to engage. That's great.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's really, I mean, it's hopeful, right? It's really hopeful that
Mhm.
young people can take leadership and teach us what we can be doing better.
Definitely. And it's great. I appreciate you being here to just share, your insights from the research you've done in Delaware and what you've seen around the nation. I mean, providing access to information and resources is fundamental to people being able to do their jobs well. And so thanks for your time. So let's just to get into our third section. What do you think are important considerations boards should keep in mind when they're making discipline policies?
Evidence.
Mm.
Look, I say this as the luxury of a tenured professor who, can say what they want within reason,
Uh-huh.
meaning if I say things that are unpopular, I'm not going to lose my job.
Right.
Um, right. Unlike an elected school board official, right,
Mm.
who if they say things that are unpopular, they won't get reelected.
Mhm.
I I appreciate that, and I'm also not accusing school board members of doing any, saying
Sure.
whatever just to stay elected. I think you only do that unless you really care about making the world a better
Yes,
place.
it is a sacrifice. Yes.
Yeah, I know, I accept that.
Mhm.
But I think often we make decisions as a society based on what sounds right, what fits our
Mhm.
common sense notions, or what the loudest voices, the angriest voices often
That
are
is very
saying,
true.
not based on evidence, not based on research, and like I think I have a grounding in reality. I know that
Mhm.
not all academic research is easily translatable, and it's not all digestible, and often it's not. Sometimes it's not right.
Mhm.
But I think that if we're not trying to learn, because there are some things where we do have very clear, consistent answers that are easily
Mhm.
accessible, we just don't care to access them.
Mhm.
And when we do things like that, it's really problematic. I mean, one of the illustrations of that is police officers in schools,
Mhm.
right? There is clear evidence that putting police officers in schools can lead to a variety of unintentional harms to students. But
Mhm.
people don't really, that doesn't fit with their common sense notions. And I'm not blaming police officers. Look, I've worked with
Mhm.
many school resource officers or police officers in schools
Mhm.
who I just think are amazing. In fact, every
Mhm.
SRO I've ever met in the state of Delaware, I think is really, a good person who, his those I've met have volunteered for that position because they want to help kids, right?
Mhm.
So this isn't anti-police officer,
Right.
but it's sort of a bad fit. When we
Mhm.
put law enforcement into schools, we produce a variety of problems, like all unintentionally, higher out of school suspension rates, higher arrest rates,
Interesting.
particularly for youth of color, right?
Mm.
So we're increasing racial inequality. There is not a documented increase in safety from putting police officers in school either.
Mhm.
So this is something where the research is informative, but it came up for debate. Certainly, my district in Red Clay came up a few years
Mhm.
ago and
Mhm.
was voted down convincingly, right? Because it doesn't fit with our notions of what works, or because, hey, there's a police officer at my kid's school and they're a wonderful presence. And that's true, right?
Mhm.
They can be a warm, kind uh, person. But when we take a step back and not think about our own lives and our own thoughts and perceptions,
Mhm.
but in aggregate, how does it shape all kids'
Mhm.
outcomes? That's really important to do, and we tend to be unwilling to do that when
Mhm.
things don't agree with our common sense notions.
Yeah, that was a really eloquent explanation, and I appreciate that. I think
Thank you.
you're also highlighting for me um, one of the responsibilities that boards have, which is I think is a big one, and I have a lot of admiration and respect for them, is what's done for the greater good. And sometimes, making those decisions, they're tough decisions to make, but looking at the evidence and sort of suspending our own preconception of how things should work or what makes sense may lead us to a better decision. And yeah, so I'm really
Agreed.
glad that you pointed that out.
Thank you.
So if a board were to implement a new policies, or what are some ways that they would track, like, is this working? How do you know if your policy is having a positive or a negative effect, especially if you can not everybody has access to a researcher, right? So like what's a board to do?
But it depends on what the policy is and what you'd start obviously with your stated goals of what am I trying to
Mhm.
accomplish with this, and what are the problems I'm trying to avoid by changing policies, and what are the noted potential concerns? Like, what did the people who didn't want this policy say might
Mm.
happen, right? So you start with a list of things to track, and then
Mhm.
you collect data on them. Um, I mean, it's not that hard to go to your local university and find PhD students looking for dissertation topics
True.
who are trained researchers
Yeah.
who will do this for free, and will jump at the chance when
Yeah.
given the data. So I think it's more accessible than folks realize. There's just
Yep.
a lack of communication between them.
That's a great point, and I think too, it highlights two things that are important to me personally. The idea that this is a collective problem, right? Everybody has a role to play because it's a societal problem, and the problem being we want to do better by children, and we want to strengthen society, and we want better outcomes so everyone can have a prosperous life. Um, I think that's the first part, but the second part is what I've found, and I very very much appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. It's okay to not know everything about everything, that you can raise your hand and say, "I've learned a lot from this conversation with you today," and every time we've spoken. That's part of the process. We don't have to know everything, but we do have to try to find out a little bit more or consult people in the areas where we're not so well versed.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I think that's true going both ways. I think that many researchers do a very poor job of learning from those working, in the trenches or on school
Mm,
boards, right? From teachers, from students, most of all,
yeah.
actually, from students, from educators, from, school board members, of,
Mhm.
of what their problems are and what their constraints are, and what they wish to see and why.
Mhm.
Researchers often aren't as humble as they ought to be in recognizing that, that the insights that we might produce are fallible, right?
Yeah.
I'm still a big believer that let me rephrase. I think that sometimes the mistake we get into is thinking that all research is problematic rather than judging on case by case basis, right?
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
some, is done well, research is.
Mhm.
Are you back?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, do you want me to start over with the whole?
You can pick up if research is done well, and that's where I lost you. So
If research is done well, it should improve what we know. Maybe not tell us everything, and there
mhm,
are limitations to any research study, but that doesn't mean we throw the whole thing out. So I think that, I'm just saying that I believe that I don't want to be one of those researchers who comes in there and says, "Oh, you have to listen to us. We know everything," because it's far from the case.
sure,
We have
sure.
a lot to learn as a group, and and there should be humility with the work that we produce, but still have it be part of the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's wonderful. Aaron, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. Your passion for creating a more equitable and effective public education system and just looking to, to ensure that we do no harm. It's admirable. I personally have left with a lot of great insights today. I know our audience enjoyed the conversation moving from democracy to the history to connecting the dots to looking at evidence and tracking data to make sure that we're achieving the things we want to. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is really a pleasure. It was fun.
I'm glad. I'm glad. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for another episode, and we look forward to seeing you soon.